Part 5. Coming Back. July 14th. 5 Rue Lecaine, Paris. Paris is wonderful now, far prettier than before, and I hate to think of leaving next Saturday. But I've decided to go to England with 2 ambulance fellows, Anderson and Lilly, and spend 2 or 3 weeks there. Then I shall sail from Liverpool and get home about the middle of August. I tried to get some information concerning the army transports and the possibility of shipping home on one. None of the army officers, however, could tell me anything about the dates and arrivals of ships, excepting that St. Nazaire was one of the ports. If my funds run low in England, I may be obliged to return to France and take passage home this way. I spent the whole morning yesterday trying to get my passport viséd by the numerous officials, such as the police and consuls, so that I might leave France. At one place they told me I couldn't go to England at all, but I didn't bother with them. I went to the British Permit Office and found that I could. I was all ready to go, after a few hours chasing around, while a young English governess whom I met at the Prefecture of Police told me she had been waiting 3 months to have her papers approved and hadn't received them yet. You can't help spending money in Paris. Besides the usual little items such as cafes, opera, and expensive meals, you want to buy everything you see. I have just paid out 210 francs for a new uniform for use in England, and 150 more for a few little Parisian trinkets to take back to the family. Dinner last evening with Anderson cost me 40 alone, and some films and printing paper at Kodak's brought this up to 90. Every time I change a 100-franc note, I see my chances as a first-class passenger on the trip home getting smaller and smaller. Bernard Larlinquet, the young artillery officer whom I met in the hospital at Chalon last month, is now in Paris. We went down together to the Avenue Saint-Germain early this morning to see the great Independence Day parade. I had heard about it before, but I never imagined that it was such a big event. Fully 50,000 troops marched by, the banner regiments of the French army. Everyone was happy, childishly happy, from the tiniest spectator who cheered with all his might to the soldiers themselves who brandished bouquets from their bayonets. When one of the crack chasseurs companies was passing us, a handsome young woman darted forth from her place among the onlookers and gave a little bunch of roses to the captain leading them. He took the flowers, stooped and kissed her, and then marched on amid the deafening applause of the crowd. Shortly after this, I got a fine close-up picture of General G, one of the most famous chasseur generals, who dismounted from his horse to shake hands with a few wounded Algerians standing beside us on crutches, when the whole parade had stopped for a moment. I took dinner with Bernard afterwards at his home near the Étoile and spent several hours with his charming family. His father is a captain in the artillery, his 17-year-old brother leaves for the front next month, and the one, 14, a Boy Scout, is working on a farm. None of these were present when I was there, but I saw the 3 younger children with their mother, who was most attractive. July 18. Paris still. I have had a pretty full program since the day of the parade. Sunday I dined again at the Larlinques, and afterwards Bernard and I promenaded on the Avenue Bois de Boulogne. There were uniforms of all the Allied armies, even a few Americans scattered in the throng. Afterwards we called on the Thurnesens, the parents of the aspirant whom I met at Point Soup. I left with them some pictures I had taken of him at the front. I stood there like a perfect dummy when Bernard introduced me to the madam, for I discovered for the first time I didn't know a single word of polite society French. I almost let slip the poilu equivalent for "glad to know you, old chap," but it dawned on me that I was in Paris, not at the front, and I kept silent. Showing her the photographs, however, started the ball rolling, and I had no trouble after that. Even the French are crazy about Charlie Chaplin. Barney Faith and I saw him in The Vagabond at the Passy Cinema this evening. Just as I am leaving, the front gets active again. Mont Cornillet is seeing some very heavy artillery fire once more, and the French are launching a big attack at Hill 304. We have had more men killed in the last month than in the whole history of the service. Craig, of Section 2, was hit by shell éclat near Damblay and died a few hours later. A bomb from a German aeroplane got Norton of Section 1 yesterday, and Gailey and Hamilton were mortally wounded near Soissons last week. Then there were several other cases I have forgotten, and of course Osborne of 28, whose funeral we attended at Montmelon. Anderson, Lily, and I leave for London tomorrow morning. Lily, to rest up after 8 months with Section 10 in Albania, and Anderson for his furlough. July 23, Regent Palace Hotel, London. We had an uneventful channel trip from Havre to Southampton, escorted by 3 British destroyers and zigzagging the entire distance. We had no trouble at either port, fortunately, and went up to London on the next train. We chose the Regent Palace in Piccadilly as our hotel because it had been recommended as the place where all officers back from France spent their permissions. Ever since we arrived, we have been on the go. Sometimes it's sightseeing, and again it is shopping, and every evening we try the theaters. Last night we saw The Maid of the Mountains, and the day before Inside the Lines. There are far more amusement places open here than in Paris, and a good many more civilians. The people seem happier, I suppose because they have not had the war brought as close to them as the French. Early Sunday morning, the air raid alarms sounded all over the city, and everyone rushed outside to get a better view of the enemy's planes, instead of going down into the cellar as the officials expect them to do. Several days ago, I found a place called the Indian Restaurant. Never thinking that this meant East instead of West Indian, I went in and ordered a meal. They brought me the queerest mess of food I have ever run across, and all of it, from the soup to the rice, was full of terrible curry. I finally gave it up and asked for some plain bread and butter, but they refused on the ground that I had already eaten the one piece which the food controllers allow at a meal. This scheme is really far more effective than the 2 wheatless days a week which they first tried, for it cuts down the use of white bread more than half, whereas the other way means only a 10 or 15% reduction. We are saluted everywhere. Once in a while a Tommy gets suspicious and doesn't bother with us, but usually he gives us a real snappy one. It was a lot of fun answering him at first, but when you have to give a couple of thousand every day, it gets tiresome. Of course, they think we are commissioned officers, or they wouldn't look at us. Even some old veterans of the Crimean War were fooled the other day, and I felt so cheap afterwards that I wanted to turn around and tell them what I was. But except for this, our uniforms are a great help. By their aid, we managed to hire a Hupmobile for the whole day yesterday, when half a dozen places had told us it was impossible to rent a car on account of the great scarcity of gasoline. They said they didn't even have enough for themselves. We toured up to Cambridge in the morning, through a number of pretty little villages with Mother Goose names. It was rather exciting at times, for neither Anderson nor I had driven a Hup before. Besides, the sudden change from driving on the right-hand side of the road to the left, which is the English way, was hard to get used to. Lily showed us around the university, Pembroke, where he himself had studied, and Christ's, Trinity, and King's colleges. The only students left are a few East Indians and some young boys. The majority of colleges have been taken over by the government for training schools. Lily learned from his proctor that 3 of his intimate friends had been killed in the service, and that practically everyone in the university had enlisted. I'm spending my money even faster here than I did in Paris. I ordered 2 new suits and a snappy raincoat from a tailor in Southampton Row. I walked over to the British Museum while I was up there, but found it had been closed for over a year. Fully a dozen people had told me before I went there that it was still open. Like the French in Paris, Londoners don't know London's attractions. Photo caption 1. A pile of dead Boches south of Mount Cornillet. They are lying in the hot sun and being eaten up by the flies. After a big attack, it is often weeks before all the dead can be buried. Photo caption 2. 2 German prisoners, sleeping on a couple of ties in a barbed wire enclosure near the front. They will soon be removed from the war zone. Photo caption. A co-drawn, double-motored observation plane, flying in the clouds 2 miles above the communication trenches visible on the right. July 27th, 1917. Hallsway Manor, Somerset. London was new and interesting, and I liked it. But this is really England here. Cardiff lies across the Channel, in Wales, and Bristol lies on one side of us and the old forest of Exmoor on the other. Then south of us is Cornwall, the land of King Arthur and of Jack the Giant Killer. We're just outside of Crowcombe, and the hills behind the house overlook the sea. I am visiting Mrs. Rowcliffe, an old friend of my mother's whom the family had told me about before I left home. She and her husband have a wonderful estate here, with a quaint old manor, part of which was built in the 13th century. When I came here, I intended to stay only one night, but this is the 3rd day now, and I am still here. Everything is new to me, from the heather and the bracken on the hills behind the manor, to the low-thatched cottages and the people themselves. Then there is the age of all the buildings. To think of living in a house built 700 years ago. But there are landmarks far older than this. The carpenter who drove me up from Stongamber Station to the Rowcliffes showed me a crude circle on the hillside, the remains of a Roman encampment. And from there on we drove up a rocky little lane over which the Phoenicians used to carry their tin to the sea. Out here you can't believe there's a war. It's all so quiet and peaceful. I have only seen one Tommy since I've been here, and he was some distance off, down on the main road. But the young men are gone just the same, though the people don't talk about it. There are no slackers loafing around. The gardener's boy is at the front, they tell me, with the Royal Engineers, and the only son of Colonel Gordon, who lives by himself in the village now, after 30 years in India, has just been killed in aviation. Every week or two, some sad news like this comes to the little place. They have only a few young fellows left. July 30. Paris once more. England turned out financially just as I thought it would. It ended with either cabling home for money, when I had received 200 extra already, trying steerage from Liverpool, or the transport idea. I figured that the last, although perhaps a wild goose chase, would be much cheaper than either of the other ways, and whatever happened, far more interesting. So here I am, back in Paris again, and ready to leave in an hour for Saint Nazaire. I got by the customs all right this morning in Havre, but arrived at the depot just as they closed the baggage car of the train, and of course I couldn't put on my steamer trunk and duffel bag. In great agony, I watched it pull out, leaving me to a 10-hour wait for the next through train to Paris. It wasn't as much of a sacrifice as I thought it was going to be, for I managed to persuade the TM office here to give me a free ticket all the way to Saint Nazaire, a distance of more than 450 miles. Later, I had a fine game of billiards in the back room of an old hotel with a convalescent English captain. Being in France once more gave me the notion that everyone ought to speak French. I became quite angry with a Tommy guarding a freight yard entrance when I politely asked him, "Où est la rue Cherbourg?" and he looked at me with a blank expression on his face. We had a good laugh together when I discovered my mistake. I carted all my luggage in a taxi to the Gare de Quai d'Orsay this morning, and afterwards went up to Rue Renaud to say goodbye to the fellows. Williams, Dixon, Gilmore, and Frudiger are in from our section, and a number of other men whom I met at the front from other sections. 110 new men arrived last week, and 100 the week before. This rapid increase from the paltry 15 who came last January on the Espang has forced the field service additional quarters. Barracks are being erected all over the grounds, and the annex at 5 Rue Lecain is housing 70 or 80 more. I spent a few hours at 21 Rue Renaud, where I got a couple of letters and some photos to take back to America for the fellows, and bade them all farewell. Then I darted around the corner to the little convent laundry near the cinema, burst in among the startled nuns, got the shirts and handkerchiefs I had left there before I left for England, and took the metro to the Place de l'Opéra. A quick supper at Duval's with Henry Houston, and then over to the Quai d'Orsay again. I am sitting in the train there now. It is due to leave in 3 minutes. August 2nd. On board the transport Florence Luckenbach in the basin at Saint Nazaire. I arrived here at 7:30 yesterday morning after sitting up all night from Paris. I left my baggage in the depot and started immediately for the docks to see how my prospects for a ride home looked. There was nothing in the first basin, but the watchman there told me there were a number of American transports further down. But alas, when I finally located them, the Marines on guard wouldn't let me go near to ask about a job for the trip. And the answer they gave me at the base office was even worse. It was impossible. They couldn't allow it. These were transports for army supplies, not for lugging back bankrupt ambulance drivers. A hot breakfast after this cheered me up a little, and I tried to break through the Marines again. This time I tackled another bunch, told a pathetic story, and they let me through on the sly. The captain was not on board, but one of the quartermaster clerks was, and after I had told him all about myself, he said he would fix me up, even if I had to go as a stowaway. There was a good chance to work my passage, however, for the chief steward and the cook were in the city jail, and they needed an extra man. They had just taken on a big Negro the day before as mess boy, and I was offered a similar job. I signed the articles before he could think twice, put my luggage on board with the ship's crane, and had it down in the poop that night, before they could fire me. He told me the captain would be back from Paris the next day, and hinted that I exchange my cane and good-looking uniform for a somewhat tougher costume, one more becoming to a mess boy's position. So when I appeared for work that evening in the pantry, I had on a rough khaki shirt and the old breeches I'd worn all the months at the front. The 2 other mess boys gave me a hearty welcome. Their work would be lighter now. They didn't let me do much because it was my first meal, and they thought I had better get used to it slowly. I washed something like 200 dishes in a thick, pasty lot of water, which they only change once a day, cleaned up the 2 mess rooms, and scrubbed the floor of the pantry afterwards. It is delightfully interesting work. I imagine 2 weeks of it will lead me to decide upon it as my life's occupation. While I was working, I learned a little about the boat and the men on it. It seems the most of them came over just for the novelty of going to France. They had had a rather disagreeable trip, and now that they were finally in France, they were only allowed to leave the boat on special permission. Even then, they couldn't leave Saint Nazaire, which is a little town and not too interesting. None of them knew more than a few words of French, but it was a simple matter getting what they wanted in their time off duty. As for the fellows in jail, they had been impudent and insulting to the officers and would probably be taken back to America in irons. They didn't know exactly when the boat was to sail, but told me confidentially it wouldn't be more than a day or 2, since only the Flower and 8 of the big guns remained to be unloaded. They had taken 14 days to cross, and figuring on this, we will get home about the 19th of August. Jack Fenton, the quartermaster clerk who signed me up, said I could sleep on the settee in his cabin tonight. So I am tucked up on it now, with a porthole above me instead of the canvas curtain on the rear of my ambulance. August 4th, 1917. On the transport Luckenbach, at sea. I thought my game was up for sure when the captain came back yesterday. He had almost decided to take me when suddenly it entered his mind that the colonel of the base wouldn't approve of it. So off he sent me to that gentleman, at whose very office I had so abrupt a dismissal the day before. But Fenton went along with me, and together we made them think that I was necessary for the safe return of the Luckenbach. I was so happy on the way back to the boat that I accosted a German road worker under an American guard to see if I could get his little cap for a souvenir. But the old boy, he must have been 45, said, "Ich würde, aber es ist verboten." And as one of his comrades explained, the French require them to wear the coat and cap of their uniforms, if they still have them, when they get out of the war zone. This forms a pretty good means of identification. Late Sunday night, the good news came that we were to sail early the next morning, and along with it, something not quite so encouraging. This was that 2 steamers had been sunk in the harbor outside the city, and another, whose watertight compartments had held, had barely been able to get to port. From the reports we got, one would have thought there was a squadron of submarines waiting. But orders are orders, and therefore at 5 this morning, with all 57 of the crew on deck, we sailed down the Loire, through 2 or 3 locks and out into the ocean. In a way, I am glad to be going home. Yet leaving now, when our troops are just arriving, and when I could get into any branch of the service from aviation to artillery, merely to enter college, doesn't seem exactly right. But the family can't see it my way. My regular mess boy duties have started now. I was up at 4 this morning to make coffee for the engineers and the officer on the bridge. I'd never made the stuff before, but I dumped 2 or 3 cups of grounds into an old pot, stole some hot water from the cook's steam chest, and let it boil on the back of the stove while I fixed some toast to go along with it. They complimented me on it when I took it to them at 5 o'clock, said it was nice and soapy, and hoped someone else would make it the next time. After this, I washed the dishes from the midnight lunch of the crew, and then started chambermaiding the rooms. You not only have to make the beds carefully, fold the pajamas, and straighten out the clothes of some measly under-officer whom you wouldn't have for a gardener at home, but you must even scrub out his washbowl and keep his brasses in good condition. I almost fell out of the porthole today when one of the engineers suggested that I remove the tobacco stains that I had left on his cuspidor. Only a few of them are cranky like this, however. They treat me pretty well, and Marty, one of my partners, says we will make $20 or $30 in tips if we keep their rooms ship-shape. I figure I ought to clear $50 on the trip, counting my salary, at $45 a month and board, which I signed for. A first-class passage on the Cunard line would cost $100 at least, so I am earning $150 just by 2 weeks of delightful work. When mealtime comes around, Marty sets the mess room table and gets things ready in general around the pantry, while John, the head mess boy, puts the officers' saloon in order. I bring all the food in from the kitchen, stuff it into the little steam table in the corner, and then go into the steward's room to copy the menu. Yesterday I tried it in French, but it didn't prove a great success, for when I asked the captain if he would like hors d'oeuvres for a starter to Sunday night's supper, he said yes, he hadn't had any good vegetable soup for a long time. Fenton can't keep me any longer on his settee, so he has found a place for me in the hole where the other mess boys bunk. It's a little bit of a room, barely large enough for 2, but they have rigged up a shelf for a bed which, although crude and too short for me, is better than the stretcher I used at the front. The only really unfortunate feature about the place is the terrible odor which seems to come through the wall behind my bed. Marty says they pulled away the boards twice on the way over in hopes of finding some dead fish or rats. There was nothing there, and still the smell comes. I think I will take to the deck if it gets any worse. Photo caption 1. The exterior of a 75 battery. A large sheet of canvas conceals the place from the enemy when the gun is not in use. Photo caption 2. The interior of the 75 shelter. A sheet of armor plate protects the artillerymen from enemy fire in front. On the left is a machine for setting time fuses. Photo caption 3. A little French town in the hands of the enemy and the trenches leading from it. The dots are shell craters, some of which are 30 feet across. The photograph was taken from a French aeroplane at 10,000 feet. Photo caption 1. Bernard Larlenque and the author at the former's home in Paris. He is just 18 years old and a second lieutenant in the French artillery. Photo caption 2. General G of the Alpin Chasseurs with his 14 different medals. August 9th. The Dead Rat Cabin on the Florence Luckenbach. We received an SOS call on Monday from the Capana, one of the standard oil tankers. She had just been torpedoed in the Bay of Biscay, 300 miles south of us. She went down in less than 5 minutes, the wireless operator said. An hour later we got submarine 10 miles ahead, and this kept everybody interested until dinner time. 2 days ago, the destroyer which had convoyed us thus far from St. Nazaire wig-wagged over that we were now out of the war zone and that she would have to leave us here. An hour later, just as a little squall set up, she turned her prow eastward and left us to the mercy of the subs. Since then, it's become rougher and rougher, and now the old tub, 10 or 12 feet higher out of the water anyway than when they came overloaded, is tossing about like a cork. Yesterday the log read only 4 knots an hour during the forenoon, and from 8 to 11 o'clock this morning we only made 2 knots. If our speed were to continue to decrease at this rate, we'd be going back towards France by tomorrow. The chief engineer, a jolly old Scotchman named Henderson, asked to see my pictures of the front today, and after we had spent some time looking at them, he took me down into the engine room and showed me the whole works. There are always one engineer and a couple of oilers below, but they don't have to work very hard. They burn crude oil instead of coal and thereby eliminate stoking. About noon they had trouble with the big piston and had to stop the ship for 2 hours to fix it. August 13th, 1917. On the Lukenbach, 1,200 miles to Nantucket. I get along pretty well as mess boy in the routine work, but now and then I pull some terrible boner. I've carried dinner up to the captain's cabin when the wind was so strong I had to crawl up the stairs backwards. Sitting for a moment on each step, and I have washed dishes when the roll of the boat almost threw them out of the sink into the rag in my hand. But this noon my luck changed. Knowles, the deposed first cook, was helping Mike in the kitchen. It was just 5 minutes before lunch, and I had given him the soup tureen to fill, so that I could have it ready in the pantry. The stuff was boiling, and I had barely lifted the full kettle off the floor when Marty came strutting past to get the key to the icebox, and knocked the whole pail out of my hand. Poor Knowles' feet happened to be in the way and were badly burned before we could pull off his socks and rub flour and oil on them. He went to bed, and I guess they can't use him any more this trip. Fenton showed me the payroll this afternoon. There are 15 nationalities represented among the 56 men in the crew. It starts out with 12 Americans and ends up with 1 Hollander, 1 Pole, and a Swiss. The latter is really French, I think. At least he knows Paris pretty well. I'm the only one on the ship who can understand him, since he only speaks a few words of English, and he comes to me and tells me all his troubles. They call him third cook, which position covers all the dirty work in the kitchen, and both of the other men jump on him if he peels potatoes when they say to sweep out the pantry, and he doesn't understand. Today was bath day for the gun crew and for some of the rest of us, too. The chief petty officer got permission to use the big fire hose, and then he squirted us while we stood stripped, on the iron deck, near the aft hatches. It was an Adam and Eve affair, which I suppose doesn't often happen on the Mauretania or the Espang. The bath freshened the gunners up so much that they fired 4 or 5 practice rounds from the 3-inch gun on the stern and a good many more afterwards, from the machine gun. They aimed at a soapbox at several hundred yards, but the ship was rolling so badly they couldn't make a direct hit. They were good shots, though, and handled the gun well. My work after supper this evening might well come under the comic section title, New Occupations. This was the pleasant task, when my dishes were done and the pantry floor had been carefully scrubbed and fresh water taken into all the rooms, of teaching the second engineer logarithms. But I shouldn't make a joke of it. Both of us were in earnest, for he was studying some mathematics relating to his work, and never having had algebra or trigonometry in school, he came to an abrupt stop at logarithms. I wanted to help him, so I got the second mate's book of tables, which had all the logs I needed, and we worked 2 whole hours over it. I had to commence at the very beginning, but he caught on quickly and seemed to have a clear idea of it afterwards. Smith, the chief wireless operator, gave me 2 interesting reports to translate today. The first was some French government stuff, from one of the African provinces, I think, and the other was in German, and evidently a press report from Berlin. The latter gave a rambling account of the resignation of the Bulgarian consul in Manchester. It commented upon the sinking of a German steamer and made some absurd statement about a congress being held in Bombay to demand home rule for India. Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company of America. Station, Atlantic Ocean. Process verbal, 45 degrees 21 clicks north, 26 degrees 10 clicks west. August 10th, 1917. Remarks. German press message probably from Berlin, which was received on the transport. It has been translated as literally as possible by Professor Priest of Princeton University. August 10th, 1917. 11:50 p.m. Someone is said to have made remarks to the Entente, which are attributed to the former Bulgarian consul Angelo in Manchester. What worth there is in this information proceeds from the fact that after Bulgaria's entrance into the war, Angelo ostentatiously gave up his office as Bulgarian consul, broke off all relations with the Bulgarian government and with Bulgarian society. If, therefore, Angelo was sent to Stockholm with any commissions, this must have been done only on the part of his friends, but not on the part of the Bulgarian government, which, of course, for the time being, makes no claim to his services. Concerning the fictitious story about the Crown Council, which it is said was held at Potsdam on June 5th, Count Berchtold, who was Minister for Foreign Affairs at that time, now declares that according to the assertion of the London Times, this Crown Council was held with the participation of Field Marshal Archduke Frederick and Chief of the Austro-Hungarian General Staff Baron Conrad and Hungarian Prime Minister Count Thiers. In reply to the utterance of Lloyd George that the Imperial Chancellor used ambiguous expressions in his explanations of the Reichstag's peace resolution, Heismath points to the explanation of the North German General News, which cleared up the matter. The German steamer Friedrich Caro from Rostock was sunk August 8th, going north off Skellefteå in Sweden. According to the report of the pilot, the sinking occurred within 800 meters of the Swedish 3-mile limit. The foreign vessel which torpedoed the German steamer remained above the surface after accomplishing its act, but bore, however, no distinguishing features. Newspapers declare this blank breach of neutrality in regard to food supplies. A Congress of East Indians and Committee of Mohammedans held a council together at Bombay, where it was demanded that India should at once receive home rule and have a share in determining her own fate, that further India should receive a constitution which is to go into effect immediately after the end of the war, and further that the English government's policy of suppression in India must cease at once. The well-known English writer Anna Besant was arrested some time ago by English authorities and held captive, as became well known at the Congress of Indians and Mohammedans. August 19th. Yeah! New York City again, but still on the boat. The watch on the bridge sighted Nantucket Light at midnight. At 7 this morning we passed Fire Island Lightship. Then in no time came Sandy Hook, Fort Wadsworth, Quarantine, and the battery itself. But the captain got orders, while we were coming up the river, to anchor off the Statue of Liberty instead of going directly to Hoboken as we had intended. It seems we took over about 20,000 shells by mistake and had to bring them all back again. They must be unloaded on lighters out here in the river, because the law forbids the bringing of such a dangerous cargo into the city docks. I guess all we can do is to sit around here and wait until they finish it. They told me I would be able to get off for good tomorrow. I was so glad to see the Woolworth building once more that I dumped all the garbage overboard in the North River, when I really shouldn't have. But being actually at New York again, and yet tied up doing dirty mess boy work on a transport rather irritates me. They wouldn't even let me send a telegram to the family notifying them of my arrival. But I think I can get one through tomorrow morning. The 2 captains, the chief engineer, and the second mate all went ashore for the evening in the launch. They took several of the crew with them, but the mess boys didn't have a chance. They were very pleasant about it, though, and one of them was kind enough to bring back a Times and a Saturday Evening Post. August 21st, 1917. On board the transport Florence Lukenbach. Still opposite the Statue of Liberty. Things have gone from bad to worse. Even the old Statue of Liberty, which I was so glad to see 2 days ago, seems to look at me and say, "I'm Liberty, all right, but you can't get near me." An immigrant couldn't feel as sore as I do if he were sent back to Europe, for there's nothing wrong with me. They don't need me so much that they couldn't do without me. It's simply that I signed up in St. Nazaire, and now they can keep me as long as they want. They have been working 2.5 days unloading the shells, and they are not through yet. A gang of longshoremen are doing the work, and one of them, to whom I gave a sandwich at lunchtime, told me they were getting $1 an hour for this overtime work. He said they made $8 or $10 a day on a good job like this. I don't know when we will get into Hoboken now. Yesterday the captain promised me Wednesday for sure, but now they say we must go into dry dock in the Erie Basin and have a new propeller put on. Sac-a-papier, this is terrible. My family is only 60 miles away at Bay Head, New Jersey. I have not received an answer to my telegram yet and don't seem to be able to get in touch with them at all. August 23rd. On board the Crazy FL, dry dock in the Erie Basin. I enjoy my work more now, with every new day that is added on to our little repose. The chambermaid part is especially delightful. I tuck in the sheets any old way, just so the counterpane covers them, and roll all the pajamas up in a ball. I guess I won't get the promised tips, but I am so sore at the whole ship I can't sleep. Bushrax, the ex-steward, has just heard of his brother-in-law's arrest and sentenced to 2 years in jail for bribery in the draft exemption cases. So together we washed away our sorrow with a bowl of grape juice and pineapple punch, which we made secretly in the icebox. We had borrowed the key unawares some time before. Ed and I had cleaned it out carefully several days ago and thrown away 200 pounds of decayed meat. Of course the place smells queer still, but the punch was excellent. They say we will be off the boat tomorrow. I don't know what this means. It was to be just 1 day more when we arrived here last Sunday, and now it is the end of the 5th. Oh, Job, I know just how you felt. The first treat I have had since we arrived came last night when I managed to get off the ship for a couple of hours and, through a telegram sent this morning, met Father at the Waldorf. And I not only did this, but I also called up Bay Head on the phone and talked with my mother and some of the other members of the family for a minute. Father and I and an old friend of the family who happened to be at the hotel took dinner together. It was wonderful to see Father again, and I had so much to say about the trip all at once that I could only talk in disconnected sentences. The worst of it all was that I had to go back to the boat again at 11 o'clock. Even then my uniform created quite a lot of excitement in the subway. I hadn't intended wearing it at first, but a quick survey of my wardrobe showed that there was nothing else to do. This afternoon I managed to get off again for a little while. I saw my brother for a couple of hours before we separated at the Grand Central Station. He was leaving for Fort Niagara to enter the officers' training camp there. My uniform helps just as much here as it did in London. I have no trouble at all going back and forth through the gates of the basin. A dignified-looking Russian major, thinking that I was a British officer, gave me a fine salute, which of course I returned in front of the hotel. August 24th, 1917. On a Jersey Central train, going home. My luck changed this morning just as Job's did one day several thousand years ago. We left the dry dock when I was finishing my rooms, and 15 minutes later were passing the Statue of Liberty. Wasn't I happy when we were actually by her and heading straight for Hoboken? We slid into the pier next to the Vaterland, and all of us waited in tense excitement for news from the captain and his payroll. But none came during the morning, so I got on my uniform, lowered all my luggage over the side by the jib crane, and saw about getting it through the customs before the captain returned. The new crew came on at noon, and we didn't have to work at all. The payroll didn't come until 4 o'clock, but I got $37.50 out of it, which was worth waiting a few hours for. Then I said goodbye to all the crew and disappeared down the ladder. 5 minutes later, I got my last glimpse of the Lukenbach from the rear end of an old truck on which my baggage and I were bumping along over the cobblestones to the 23rd Street ferry. After I got over to Manhattan, I checked my luggage from the Jersey Central Station, and now I am on the train home. No more Lukenbach, only the family and a quiet time at the seashore for a few weeks. Princeton opens in September, and I'll be there with the rest. But next fall, it will be France again. Photo caption 1. The Colt machine gun on the stern of the Lukenbach. Photo caption 2. Smith, the wireless operator, and Georgia Jones going ashore in the motorboat. Mess boys remain on board. Lifeboats are lowered in this manner. Photo caption 3. Unloading one of our 30-ton guns. Photo caption 4. Practice with the 3-inch gun on the Lukenbach.